Good morning, everyone. It is so nice to be here, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to share the Dharma together with everyone. Of course, at this time, I want to honor all the people who have suffered so terribly in the pandemic, which is afflicting everybody in one way or another. And we hope everyone has a speedy recovery and perhaps a vaccine comes sooner than later. So I have been giving a series of talks on the Lotus Sutra for a number of months now. And this is actually my 8th talk. And the talks that I have given before were chapter by chapter, line by line analyses, which were fine and appropriate at the time. But now we are in the midst of the pandemic and everything has changed. We're in the Zoom world and people can come from anywhere. And I've invited a number of people to come, some of whom are not Buddhists and don't know much about Buddhism at all. So what I'm doing today is I'm starting from scratch. And this is really an introduction to the sutra. This is the first of 4 talks, which I'll be giving throughout July. And I will be giving a fair amount of background that's indirectly related to the sutra. In subsequent talks, I'll go into further detail. I have plenty of time. Actually, I wrote 2 talks. One was a more technical one, giving background, contextualizing the sutra, showing how it's structured, on and on and on like that. And I think it could really bore the audience and it could probably put me to sleep. So I'm doing a more heartfelt talk, more about my relationship with the Dharma, with the sutra, but the information about the Lotus Sutra is going to come through in spirit. Of course, I will be referring to it from time to time throughout the talk. This is really fun. This must be what Stephen Colbert feels like when he opens his show. You're sort of sitting alone, except you're with any number of people. It's a very interesting environment. So what I will do, I'm going to give one paragraph about the Lotus Sutra to kind of whet your appetite. And I think that if anybody is really interested, you can do a quick Google search and find out all sorts of background things about the sutra. It really isn't something that you'll miss from my talk. So the Lotus Sutra, of course, is a Mahayana Sutra, which I understand some people may not be familiar with that term, but it's the later teachings of the Buddha. And it seems to have been compiled in the 2nd century AD, and it was translated into Chinese by Kumarajira in around 400 AD. So it is a sprawling sutra with close to 80,000 characters in Chinese, 300 or 400 pages in English, and it has 28 chapters with 2 sutras sort of back to back, front and back, and that makes it close to 30 chapters. Its influence in Asia has been immense: cultural, intellectual, political, artistic, and it has been the object of intense devotion. There are practitioners who make pilgrimage as offerings to the sutra. They take 2 steps and make a full prostration for every single character in the sutra, which runs to 80,000 characters, as I mentioned. Some monks and abbots are reported to have recited the sutra as much as 1,000 times a month. One Chinese abbot supposedly recited the sutra 37,000 times in 30 years, although I personally don't see how that's physically possible. And some monks have even written the sutra in their own blood. And the sutra has spawned great works of art, stories, plays, and more than 1,500 years worth of commentary, exegesis, disputes, and political reform movements. So that's what's girding my talk, so to speak. But what I'm going to talk about a lot today is something a little more personal. It's really about how I encountered the Dharma and how that led me to the Lotus Sutra. So I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood in White Plains, New York. Somewhat privileged, as you might imagine, not terribly rich, but not many worries. I had no idea what I wanted to do in life. So I went to college only because everyone else did. Kind of, we're all bozos on this bus. I studied French and literature, and I graduated clueless and depressed. I remember staring at the wall all summer after I graduated. I worked for a short while, and then I took a trip around the world, studying in Europe, but eventually, quite by accident, landing in Taiwan, where I fell in love with the Chinese language and especially the characters. I had no idea what I wanted to do. So I applied to Columbia University in Chinese literature, and for some bizarre reason, they accepted me. And I was there for 5 years. So, and I had to begin Chinese and Japanese from scratch at 25. Not the smartest thing I ever did. So I felt quite lost. And because of a friend who I'm no longer in touch with, I went on a Buddhist meditation retreat. I had no idea what I was getting into. The instructions said to bring a cushion, and I brought a couch pillow from my family's couch. I had never seen a meditation cushion. So now I've been practicing Buddhism since 1975, and I've been a Dharma teacher since 2005. Looking back, I can see that as you continue on the path, you start to juggle two things. First, there is your raw experience from meditation. And then there is your conceptual understanding of the teachings, your kind of framework of the Dharma. One goes back and forth from the experiential to the conceptual. This will make more sense when I get into the Lotus Sutra. But back in 1975, of course, I wasn't exactly aware of these polarities. I went on my first retreat, and then it was a mind-boggling, life-changing experience. This was not a Chan retreat. This is 5 years before I met Master Sheng Yen. It was in the Theravadan tradition, the old school of Buddhism, which figures very largely in the Lotus Sutra, right? These kind of valences between the different traditions. So this, the fact that I started in that tradition is quite relevant to the talk on the Lotus Sutra, because the Theravadan tradition represents, as I said, the earliest part of the Buddhist tradition, and the Lotus Sutra is part of the later Mahayana tradition. So my experience of moving from one tradition to the other is an interesting contrast to what actually transpires in the Lotus Sutra, since much of it is about making the argument that the later tradition is superior to the former. Although I personally have and continue to have great love and respect for the earlier teachings. I remember the teacher that I first had, my first Buddhist teacher. His name was Robert Hover. He was an American who was a NASA space engineer. And he first taught us how to follow the breath. This is called Anapana, and it's not terribly different from the counting the breath method that we use in Chan or Zen. It seems simple. Just breathe. That was something I could handle. But then keep track of your in and out breaths and don't let your mind wander. After the first period, I did this, and I was astonished at the number of questions that people had on something that I thought was so simple. Before this experience, I was not aware that my mind seemed to have a mind of its own. Sure, I used to think extensive, deep, self-involved thoughts, but I thought that was me. It was quite a revelation to find out that I was not my thoughts. Still, I had a sense of I, and that seemed fine, except the teachings say that sense is an illusion, this sense of I, the ego-oriented way we live our lives, and it's something which causes suffering. And I thought, what? it seems like if I lost that I would be as good as dead. Or if I wasn't that I, who was I? Anyone who studied Zen or any form of Buddhism can recognize this seeming dilemma. So I continued practicing these many years, continuing to practice meditation daily, going on retreats several times a year, and I'm still I-making, which is the phrase we use for continually reinforcing this illusory sense of I. It's very sticky, very hard to drop that kind of attachment. It's being caught up in the world. So interestingly enough, my enthusiasm and devotion to the practice continues to grow. That doesn't mean that I don't have much further to go. But I continued to study the Dharma intensively. I attended talks given by Master Sheng Yen, and I went on numerous meditation retreats. When I finally became a Dharma teacher, I became more aware of the need to express the teachings so other people could understand them, which is what teachers should do. But it is amazing how you can think you understand something, tell someone else about it, and then find out that you didn't know what you were talking about in the first place. So I continued to read scholarly works and study the sutras. I once heard the famous Dharma teacher Joseph Goldstein say that he read sutras not as information, but as instructions. And looking in this more deeply, I began to see that a sutra, though it may seem to have been written millennia ago, is alive in this moment, right now. After all, in the Diamond Sutra, it says that Buddhas and Bodhisattvas emerge from the sutra itself. The Lotus Sutra, I was to find out, it makes even greater claims. Nonetheless, it was very tempting to read this sutra as a series of short stories and then try to compare them to world literature or your ideas of what is or what isn't. And of course, those ideas are just ideas that your ego has manufactured, and they will lead you nowhere. But reading, and more importantly, very importantly, contemplating the sutra alerts you to the way the mind works. You notice your reactions. You read the sutra. You recognize the nature and the causes of your reactions. You go back to the sutra and then back to the practice. Each time the world looks a little different. Nonetheless, like many practitioners, I found that my understanding of the Dharma seemed to lag behind the way I actually act and think. In other words, I speak a better game than I play. This is quite normal. But if you are a serious practitioner, you are really and truly trying to see the world as it is, and you're not trying to fabricate what you'd like it to be. If you're a Chan practitioner, you're doing it so you can be of use in the world and help other people. In that spirit, I've always been aware of the great body, the enormous body of Buddhist writing, and I was always looking for a particular teaching or a particular sutra that would show the way to the proper attitude, concept, and insight that would help me break free from these reoccurring patterns, going over the same thing, making the same mistakes, going in and out of relationships or jobs, and getting into this cycle, which is pretty much what we refer to as the cycle of samsara, which is often referred to as the cycle of life and death. And of course, if you are on board with rebirth and reincarnation, that makes perfect sense. But even if you're not, these patterns you can see happen on a daily basis, as a matter of fact, on a momentary basis. And getting aware of those kind of movements of the mind are essential to the practice. So of course, this kind of seeking that I was doing, that seeking in itself can easily be attachment. That is, you hang on to some thought or aspiration and you make it a thing, you reify it, you worship in it in a way. you might proudly say to yourself, ha, enlightenment is right around the corner. And then you're just off in a cloud of wandering thoughts. There are 1,000 ways that attachment works. It is driven by what we Buddhists call the 3 poisons of greed, hatred, and ignorance. Greed and hatred are relatively easy to understand. Ignorance is the one that is most difficult, and it really means ignorance of the 4 noble thoughts, which 4 noble truths. And in a Chan or Zen tradition, it means ignorance of the workings of the mind itself. But these things, greed, hatred, and ignorance, are what turn samsara. So then in 2018, I had the opportunity to take a seminar on the Lotus Sutra at Columbia University. I knew it was a very famous and important sutra, but in all my Dharma wanderings, I had really never read it, never encountered it. So I was very curious. The Buddha says that it is the most difficult sutra to understand. On the surface, that doesn't seem accurate. At first, it seems to be a series of parables and miraculous events, which are, on the surface, pretty easy to assimilate. They are, of course, to be sure, very profound, and there is no end to the meaning you can find in these parables and metaphors. Still, the sutra, for the most part, doesn't have arcane or difficult to decipher passages like other sutras. But there is a great vehicle teaching in the Lotus Sutra. And I'm just going to say a word about that because it will come up in a moment. Basically, the Buddha announces a new teaching which supersedes all of the older teachings, the teachings that were given to the earlier followers who are called Shravakas, the teachings that were given to Bodhisattvas, the representative of the Mahayana, and teachings that superseded Prateka Buddhas, solitary Buddhas, who keep to themselves and they don't write memoirs. And so this great vehicle, which I may go into in detail a little bit further, was one of the things that is proclaimed right at the beginning of the Lotus Sutra. And one cannot understand it. It is beyond human comprehension as it's defined by the Buddha. So when the Buddha says that the Lotus Sutra is the most difficult to understand, if you take that into account, then you can probably see how that might be true. So this Columbia course that I took was in the religion department, but not many of the students or the professor were practitioners. And thus it became like studying the Bible as literature. And I have certainly approached this from a different point of view in these past 2 years. So now I'm going to take the talk in a slightly different direction. And I want to go back to my state, which I referred to earlier, before I went on my retreat in 1975, when I was really miserable and depressed and at my wit's end. So this will let me give an analysis of that kind of situation in classic Buddhist terms. And I think this might be helpful for people who are new to this practice. And these teachings that I'm going to talk about are not in contradiction to anything in the Lotus Sutra, but they are not the great vehicle per se. And that's one of the things we'll have to try to tease out. So I'm going to use my assistant. This is my assistant, Fred. And he is, wait, I have to get used to the polarity here. I assure you he gets minimum wage. No? All right, well, help is very difficult and hard to find now. But he's going to show you exactly what it was like when I was in such a depressed mode. My views of the world were completely at odds with what was going on. I had what is called an upside down view. You see that? This is an illustration. I've got to get the, used to the mirror image. This is very funny. There he is, upside down, but in a state of denial, which is one of the things that happens. Fred, how are you? I'm right side up. You see, he doesn't recognize his state. And this is much like Furry Lewis's blues song, been down so long, it feels like up to me. Sorry, the Zoom just disappeared for a second. Okay, and so there he is with this upside down view, and all right, and sorry, this, there I am, okay. And 1 second. Let's see, slight technical difficulties. There we go. And down. So continuing with the bear's problem. So in this kind of state, one becomes exceedingly tense and worried and uncomfortable and ridden with anxiety. Notice his state, right? And so if I quickly take his blood pressure, look at it, it's 300 over 150. So you can see the state that he's in. So this is a state where he is in and experiencing dukkha. This is the Sanskrit word for suffering, unease, dissatisfaction, uncertainty. And he's not happy. Nope. You can see that. So he's first in a state of denial, but then he happens to be, and it's hard to tell by the look of him, he happens to be a very diligent student. And in recognizing his situation, he has experienced what's called samvega, which is what's called being fed up with the world, realizing that something is wrong. There's a Hopi word for this also, koyaanisqatsi, which is what Philip Glass used to name a movie he wrote the music to, or that name was used. And koyaanisqatsi means life out of balance, or my favorite translation of it is life lived in such a way that you better get yourself another way of living. So this is what's happened to Fred. And what happens is that he begins to understand that he is suffering. And he recognizes that he may have some contribution to the way that he's suffering. So he realizes the first noble truth, that of suffering itself. Now he starts to look at the causes of his suffering. He begins to get a sense that the suffering didn't come from nowhere. And suffering, according to the Buddhist understanding, is simply about wanting to have a given situation be different than it actually is. This plays out in desire, wanting what you don't have, or grasping tight to what you do have, or aversion, pushing something unpleasant away. I'm not unpleasant, not you. When it's not feasible, and trying to always keep unpleasant things from occurring, which is also unfeasible. Fred then discovers the noble truth, the recognition that he doesn't have to suffer. And then he follows the fourth noble truth to the path of suffering. And then he starts to relax. You can see his limbs loosen, his back straightens. He's floating now in a state of complete calm and relaxation. How's that? Nice. And we're going to send him back to his studies. And he will continue to relax. And what happens, once again, when one goes through this process and really examines how one is in the world and follows this path, which of course has a lot to do with learning about meditation, sitting down, watching your mind, seeing how it works, seeing the tricks that it plays on you. So Master Sheng Yen said that wisdom has no vexation and compassion has no enemies. This is when you are really at the end of the path and you have realized all the fruits of the practice. So wisdom is a state where a sense of self has been abandoned, and not one's role in the world or relationships with other people. It doesn't mean dropping out, but it means being calm and observant. And compassion is a state of true empathy, treating others exactly as you'd like to treat yourself, with no barriers. There's a saying that if you want knowledge, learn something every day. If you want wisdom, let go of something every day. So with the accomplishment of wisdom and compassion complete, the mind is utterly clear. And sometimes people think that Buddhism is passive, which it can be, but it's really about clarity. With clarity, you can address a situation with denial, and with wisdom and compassion, bring about the best possible outcome. And I also wanted to add this, an African proverb, which says, once you subdue the enemy within, the enemy without is already conquered. And of course, from a Chan perspective, as Shifu Saying said, there really are no enemies except the ones of our own making. This is not always easy to accept, or certainly not that easy to understand in a certain way, but it's certainly something worth investigating. So, and it doesn't mean that there aren't real factors out there, real things that are happening now in our crazy country, and the divisiveness and the sadness and the anger and fear that people are feeling is quite real. But once again, like everything, we can look into the causes. Causes and conditions, we call it in Buddhism. So I remember once hearing the Dalai Lama talk, and this is a number of years ago, he was talking about President Bush and his demonization of Saddam Hussein. And His Holiness pointed out that it is we who supplied Iran with the weapons that made him so dangerous. So then blaming becomes a little bit more difficult. It's not as simple. And one of the things that we learned with the practice is about responding rather than reacting. And I had said that I wouldn't be talking about the Lotus Sutra until the latter half of the talk. However, that was an expedient means, a slight lie, because this thing I did with Fred and illustrating the Four Noble Truths, that really is an expedient means. And an expedient means is one of the heart teachings of the Lotus Sutra. And we'll go into that a little bit more. An expedient means can be understood as telling a white lie with wisdom and without self-interest. In the chapter on expedient means, the Buddha directly confronts the possibility that he is lying when he describes a situation that is not actually the case. However, as you will see further in the sutra, this seeming lie brings about a very positive outcome, and there's no personal gain. So also, expedient means is a very important teaching. It's also good to understand that there's the expedient means that the Buddha is able to express and use. And it is really a paramita, a perfection of wisdom. It's actually the seventh of a list which includes comporting yourself properly, being generous, patient, persevering, concentrating, and wise. Those are the first 6 paramitas. So Jimmy, you once explained to me that real expedient means is nothing to really be played around with, but it's something that we can use in our daily lives on a perhaps a more shallow basis. But remember, it does appear in other places in the world. So if you think about the story of King Solomon in the Bible, who is confronted with 2 women who claim to be the mother of the same child. I'm sure many people know this story. And King Solomon says, fine, I'll cut the child in half and give you each a half of the child. Obviously, it's the real mother who says, no, don't harm the child, give it to the other woman. She's not going to see her flesh and blood slaughtered. And then King Solomon knows who the real mother is. It's debatable whether he would have slain the child if no one spoke up, but those were different times. And another way of looking at expedient means just on a more simple, casual ways. Imagine playing tea party with a 3 or 4-year-old. That's really expedient means, because there's no tea, there are no cookies, there are no cakes if you're just playing with plastic toys. So, but what if you were to say to the child, hey, there's really no tea in that pot, you're being foolish. This would be what Albert Ellis, the psychologist, called a black truth. But to go along with this kind of thing is expedient means. So I've gotten this far, and now I want to go a little bit deeper into the sutra itself and talk about expedient means from the Buddhist point of view. It seems a good segue into the sutra, right? So in the second chapter on skillful means, it becomes clear why this one Buddha vehicle that I actually mentioned before, this great vehicle, is not elucidated. It's beyond comprehension. And actually, given beyond comprehension, I want to bring up a very important understanding that Robert Thurman said about encountering a lot of sutras and what happens in them. And he used this phrase, tolerance of incomprehensibility. And that doesn't mean blindly believing in things, but it means having the patience and the perseverance and the underlying faith to deal with things that either are just too difficult at the moment or are beyond your capacities, yet you continue. And developing this, it actually feeds into another understanding in the practice, which is Anupitaka Dharma Kashanti. That is the patience to understand that no dharmas are arising. This is a very advanced view, but it's important to mention things like this. This underlies our practice and our study of the sutra, to see that we are creating the world, but with our own images of it. And this doesn't mean, of course, that you have built your computer with your mind. This is not Harry Potter, right? Things don't just appear out of nowhere. but it means that when you encounter the world, you put your own spin on everything that you are encountering. And this is almost unperceptible because we have built up so much karma, so much habit energy in believing what we believe. I often use this example from Catch-22 when Yossarian is speaking to Orr, and he says to Yossarian, "You have flies in front of your eyes." And Orr says, "No, I don't. I don't have flies in front of my eyes." And Yossarian says, "You can't see the flies in front of your eyes because you have flies in front of your eyes." It's a little ridiculous, but it's a good anecdote. So here we are listening to the Buddha start to elucidate on expedient means. So it is one and the same with the wisdom of the Buddha, and that wisdom is unknowable by anyone other than the Buddha. There's a passage in this chapter where the Buddha says that if 100,000 Sariputras, those are the wisest, he was the wisest of his disciples, if they were stood on end to end and all of their wisdom compiled and concatenated, it still wouldn't come anywhere close to what the Buddha's wisdom is. And this is why when the Buddha was first enlightened, he had some moments of doubt that his teachings could be understood by ordinary sentient beings like us. And that is the underlying reason that he teaches using expedient means. What they show is that you can comprehend the incomprehensible, but just not in ways that you think. And so actually this is a good moment for a little break to read a poem by Emily Dickinson, which she wasn't a Buddhist, but this is the same message in a different way. This is a poem called "Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant." So it says, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant," that is, expediently. "Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind." So this is a wise observation that that Emily Dickinson made in understanding how difficult it is for us to change. So continuing, the Buddha tells Sariputra that Buddhas appear in an evil world of 5 pollutions. This starts to sound familiar, right? The pollution of the age, or kalpa, and that seems to be an apt description of our life and times in this country right now. And the pollution of afflictions. These are vexations. These are the greed, hatred, and ignorance, also envy and conceit. All the things that try to make our minds waver off from the truth. So that's the second of the pollutions. And then the pollution of living beings, just the way that we are with one another, our limited capacity, and our limited faculties, and all of the other things that perhaps keep us in separate groups. And then there is the pollution of views. This is a very fundamental teaching, also very hard to perceive, but it's talking about how we view the world, the prejudices, biases, opinions, all of these things that we have that we are certain are true. Like, I saw this movie and it stinks. There's no other viewpoint that I will entertain. My viewpoint is right. And now that's pretty strenuous, but it can be, these kind of views can be very, very subtle. And then the last kind of pollution is the pollution of the lifespan, that we are here on the earth for a limited time. And this curtails what we can do if we're not diligent. And that's why the Buddha is always urging us to be diligent. The Buddha recognizes that he must use skillful means to help save sentient beings who are usually too beset with their own problems to truly help themselves. And now here's another wonderful aspect of this sutra. The Buddha says, I took a vow because I wanted all living beings to be equal to me without any distinctions. This is a very un-Abrahamic kind of sentiment. You know, you don't hear this God describing himself like this. There's usually, you know, a real disparity. The Buddha is saying that there really ultimately is no disparity, or there can be no disparity. And that is the reason, as he says in the sutra, that he has come to teach, to make this happen. So in other words, he wants all sentient beings to become Buddhas, and that is a promise given in the sutra. And he fulfills this vow by using a variety of explanations and parables and other kinds of expressions. These skillful means include poetry, similes, causal explanations, in other words, showing how one thing leads to another, passages of dialogue, and any means to reach both dull and quick minds. Once sentient beings develop some faith and understanding about this one great vehicle, which is the ultimate offering that is in the sutra, one great vehicle, he offers a myriad of ways that sentient beings can follow its teaching. So in this chapter on on expedient means, there's a long list of practices that explain how one can follow the Buddha path. And these practices run the gamut from almost austerities to building stupas, making drawings, playing instruments, and offering to practice, as simple as a child drawing in the sand, or even a simple nod of the head. Just one slight variation in your behavior and the faith behind it can make a tremendous difference. Basically, the longest journey begins with one step. That's what that's saying. And all of these practices, of course, have to be done with sincerity. And so the Buddha offers the promise of everyone becoming a Buddha. So I find this really quite remarkable about the sutra, that it spans these remarkable seeming polarities from the Buddha, who if you read the sutra, has utterly miraculous powers. He is can be anywhere, can see any part of the universe, can span time and space as he likes, and has a whole host of supernormal powers. Something I may talk about in a subsequent talk. But the Buddha knows his teachings are hard to comprehend, and he knows that sentient beings have to have faith and understanding to succeed. And so this faith and understanding intertwine and reinforce one another, right? So it's not about having blind faith, right? And it's not about having the faith of admiration. That's another kind of faith where you see someone who impresses you, and so you want to follow in their path for one reason or another, but you don't know quite what's going on with them. As B.B. King said, nobody loves me but my mother, and she could be jiving too. So that's not necessarily the best reason. But when you have faith that is the result of experience, that you actually know something to be true on some level, that is very reinforcing. So the Buddha, once again, talks about how he knows all of these things. So he expounds his teachings in parables and stories. So we can parse these teachings into manageable and understanding explanations and practices. And I think it's probably apropos at this point. Oh, let's see what time it is. Because I do want to leave some questions, some time for questions. And I was just about to launch into the first parable of how that works, and the parable of the burning houses, and how the Buddha shows that all of the different three vehicles of Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas, and Bodhisattvas are now superseded by this new great vehicle. And that's not a bad place to stop. I could go on for hours, of course, but I think that now we could sort of open it up and see if people have questions, impressions, comments, whatever. I'm happy to hear.
Great. Thank you, Harry. Now we have about 10 minutes left for Q&A. So if anyone have questions, please feel free to ask. Oh, I see Simon raised his hand.
Hi, Henry. Thank you for your talk today and your time.
Oh.
I had a question as you're describing sort of the steps on how you got, like, in terms of, you know, you live life and you get kind of fed up, and that's the point where you start to see suffering and, you know, walk the path or start the journey of a beginning or a new life or something.
Mm-hmm.
The question was, what if you haven't reached that sort of rock bottom state where you still want things, you still think that, you know, if I had, you know, $50 million, enlightenment would be there for me.
Right.
Is that sort of a feasible sort of thing to be able to balance? Is like, okay, I know that ultimately this is going to lead to suffering, right? But at the same time, I have these desires still there. I can't get rid of them, but, you know, I guess it's sort of a gradual process of shedding these desires and kind of, you know, going towards the other path. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that, sort of the conflict there.
Sure. Simon, thanks. I think that's a very good question. And also, just to give you impression, this idea of rock bottom, I mean, my life was really pretty comfortable. And I know when I first heard this teaching of life is, it's often misstated as life is suffering. It doesn't mean that there's no pleasure in life at all. It's not about these events. It's about how you react to them. It's about attachment. So I mean, there is this phrase in Chinese about how it's difficult for a rich person to practice because their life is so comfortable. But there are many very, very rich people who become very devout Buddhists. So you can see on the simplest level of how things don't go the way that you want. I remember coming back from my first retreat. There was this toaster oven that we used to use to toast in the bottom of my stove, and I couldn't pull out the bottom tray. And I had just come back from a retreat, and I was so calm and so serene. And then I started getting so angry because this thing wouldn't open. So if you really look closely, you'll see that there are all sorts of things during the day, even that seem minute, but if you really, you know, turn the light around, as we say, and watch how your mind is reacting, I think that can give you the fuel, if you will, you know, the impetus for practice.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. That's helpful.
Sure.
Great. So anyone else have questions? Did someone just send a question over
I
chat
don't know if
room?
that's
Let's see.
Oh, no, I got some kudos for Fred.
Oh, I saw Miranda
He's going to
raised
get
her
a
hand.
raise. Oh, okay. Please.
Go ahead.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. That was great.
Sure, thank you.
And I have a question regarding the expedient means and how it's related to the 6 paramitas. Could you clarify that relation, or is there actually, or did I misunderstand? Thank you.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, I did go over that very quickly. Remember, traditionally there are 6 paramitas, but then also in the Mahayana you can find 7, right? And paramitas mean perfections or crossing over. And the word perfect means they perfect each other. They are all combined. You can define one of them, but they're sort of connected. So in one sense, once you have really mastered the teachings of generosity and comportment, discipline, and patience, and persistence, and concentration, and wisdom, when you have this very clear view of the world and not much sense of self left, that understanding that I was talking about is that, and in that way you can really exercise the paramita, because then afterwards there are paramitas of vows and ultimately a paramita of knowledge, even though people don't think of knowledge as one of the things that you would associate exactly with Buddhism. We usually talk about wisdom. So it's something to look at further, Miranda. I was just cautioned by this by Jimmy Yu, who you may know, who's the professor of Buddhism at
Tallahassee.
In Tallahassee. Yeah, so he just cautioned me to not use expedient means lightly, and that to understand how profound a teaching and device it is.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Sure. Oh, Mark Palmer raised a hand.
Hello, Harry.
Hey, Mark.
Most excellent talk. Thank you so much. I have probably 10,000 questions, so I won't ask any. But I will say that what has moved me and touched me a lot about your talk is that how practical this is. This is useful for everyday life. It is not simply a philosophy, and you've made that quite clear. And I want to say that this has inspired me to look for more and more practical ways to apply this in my relationships with other people, in my own work, and in my own life. So thank you so much. I appreciate that. But any comment you want to make about making this practical and accessible to the layperson would be very helpful here. Thank you.
Yeah, just to say, so nice to hear your voice, Mark, a friend from out west. I mean, the most practical thing is that the practice, our lives transpire in the moment. When you are in the moment, really in the moment, then a lot of the way that we label our experience, label other people, and exercise our biases and prejudices, those can fall away. And this moment right now is basically all we got until the next one arises. So it really is ultimately the most practical thing in the world. And when you get very interested in the practices, you really can be seduced by the intellectual nature. But I always try to make it point back to right now.